Hey everyone, we are on chapter 5 of the book of Esther. This is part of our women's Bible study that we've been doing at Lake Fork Pentecostal Church, so hopefully you can join us. It's Sundays at 5 to 5:45. They also have a men's Bible study group and a youth group as well. But if you can't join us, then the women, you can request to join the Facebook group called Reaching for Jesus, a Bible study group for women. Or you can go back on my YouTube videos. I have done a video for each chapter of the book of Esther so far. So if you haven't watched videos 1 through 4, feel free to do that. So what I'm going to do is read chapter 5 of the book of Esther, and then we're going to go back and study it out verse by verse. So chapter 5 of Esther. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom. And Esther answered, If it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther hath said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed. Then answered Esther and said, My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition, and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king hath said. Then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up, nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches, and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman said moreover, Yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself, and tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends unto him, Let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Okay, so let's go back and study this out verse by verse. Verse 1 says, Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel, and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. So this is after 3 days of fasting. So it says it came to pass on the third day. So if we go back to chapter 4, verse 16, Esther says, Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise. And so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So chapter 5 starts us out after Esther has fasted for 3 days. And it says she stood while the king sat upon his royal throne. So to get kind of an idea of how the king is sitting, I really liked this commentary that kind of detailed the layout of the palace. It says, In a Persian pillared hall, the place for the throne would be at the further end, midway between the side walls. The throne would be elevated on steps and would command a view down the midmost avenue of columns to the main entrance, which would commonly occupy that position. So she was standing in a way, waiting to be seen by the king. Okay, verse 2. And it was so, when the king saw Esther the queen standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. So the king sees Esther the queen standing, and she obtained favor in his sight. If we go back to Esther 2 and 15, it says, And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. So there's been other times that Esther has found favor with others. The king held out his scepter. Her illegal intrusion was forgiven and she was accepted. So she drew near and touched the top of the scepter, probably in a way of thanks and submission. And if we look at chapter 4, verse 11, it talks about how it was illegal for her to go to the king without being called. It says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come unto the king into the inner court who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. Okay, so the scepter, this is something that I wrote, just some thoughts. The scepter that Esther once feared was extended to her. She was put there for a reason, this reason, by God, who is the sovereign ruler of the universe, who holds the ultimate scepter as the King of all kings. Let's get a picture in our minds about what could have happened that day. The king is on the throne, most likely hearing request after request and speaking to those he has called for various matters. He looks up to see Esther, the queen, in her royal apparel. This probably surprises him because he hasn't called for her in a month. She obtains favor in his sight just as she did when they met. He extends the scepter, inviting her closer. From the scripture we read she approached. It does not mention her bowing, but standing like the regal queen she has come to be. This isn't some impoverished orphan who won a beauty contest. No, those years have passed. The king saw Esther the queen that day, glorious in her royal apparel, standing tall, not weak and groveling. Could he see a change in her? Was something different? Did the 3 days of fasting show a closeness to the Lord that he couldn't quite explain? Did her countenance and demeanor give the impression that she was on a mission and that as queen she had a right to go boldly before the throne? So if we look at Hebrews 4:16, it says, let us therefore come boldly unto the throne of grace, that we obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. We are given permission by God to go boldly to him as Christians. What do we do when we go before him? Matthew 7:7 says, ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. Philippians 4:6 says, be careful, that means anxious, for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. So this was written for our women's Bible study group. So I wrote, are we daughters of the Most High King? But are we children of the Most High King? Then straighten your crown and go to the Lord as he has told you to do. Go boldly and bravely to him with your request. There is nothing he cannot handle. In fact, his plans for you are more than your biggest desires. So Esther has went before the king, and she was afraid of that scepter if he would extend it or not. But I think she went very boldly and bravely, and he extends that scepter out to her. So verse 3 says, then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther, and what is thy request? It shall be given thee to the half of the kingdom. So that is like the king saying, what can I do for you, Esther? I'll give you the world. Verse 4, and Esther answered, if it seem good unto the king, let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. So it says that I have prepared. It seems as if she was already planning on asking the king and Haman to a banquet before letting her request be made known. The way that she has it worded, it's like she has already prepared the banquet. So I used to think that maybe when she went to the king, she had gotten nervous about letting her request known, about, asking him about the decree that was passed to kill all Jews. I used to think she was nervous and kind of changed her mind and said, oh, we'll just come to this banquet. But whenever I'm reading it this time around and studying it out a little bit more, I believe that Esther had a revelation while she was fasting, or a feeling that maybe she should delay a little bit. So that she needed to go before the king, but to ask him and Haman to a banquet before speaking about the true issue. The banquet was already prepared when she tells the king. She had faith that he would hold that scepter out, and she had faith that he would come to that banquet. So she has already gotten that prepared. She knew that the Lord was guiding her. Many times in the Bible, there are revelations, directions, and instructions given while someone is fasting. So let's look at a few of those. Exodus 34:28 says, "And he," this is talking about Moses, "was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights. He did neither eat bread nor drink water, and he wrote upon the tables the words of the covenant, the 10 Commandments." If we look at the book of Acts 13:2, "As they ministered to the Lord and fasted, the Holy Ghost said, Separate me, Barnabas and Saul, for the work whereunto I have called them." So I believe that God put it on Esther's heart to delay. Although Esther does not know what will happen that very night, God knows. He works all things out according to his timing. And haven't we ourselves been made to wait, although we don't really understand why? So let's go to verse 5. "Then the king said, Cause Haman to make haste, that he may do as Esther hath said. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared." So he quickly calls for Haman to do as Esther requests. He knows that she would not risk her life to just ask them, to a banquet to eat food. So he's probably pretty intrigued to know what Esther's real request is. And the king and Haman go to the banquet. So something we talked about at the women's Bible study was, what was Esther feeling like as she was getting all these preparations ready, and now she's at the banquet with the king, and she's sitting with Haman, knowing that he is trying to annihilate her and her people. So I just wonder what was going through her head. Okay, verse 6. "And the king said unto Esther at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? Even to the half of the kingdom it shall be performed." So again, he's saying that same phrase. So banquet of wine, that made me a little curious. So I did some digging around, and it was custom in Persia that after the meats were removed from the feast, that they would have wine and fruit. So this is like after their main course, and now they're moved on to the wine part of the banquet. The king again asked Esther what her petition is. Now we're going to read verses 7 and 8 together. "Then answered Esther and said, My petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king hath said." So Esther requests for Haman and the king to come again the next day to another banquet, and then she will tell him what is really on her mind. So she feels the need to delay again. And the Lord was in all this. We're going to see later why it was so important that she waited, because something was going to happen that very night. So let's read verse 9. "Then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai." So indignation means anger or annoyance provoked by what is perceived as unfair treatment. Haman walks out feeling joy. He's really proud that he was personally invited to a banquet by the queen, and only him and the queen and king were there. So he feels really proud about that. He's full of joy. But then he sees Mordecai, and he cannot stand the fact, he is consumed by this, that Mordecai does not bow down to him and does not show him reverence. So all this joy he was feeling was just taken away by Mordecai standing there. Verse 10. "Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife." So he refrained himself. He stopped himself from probably punishing Mordecai or harming him. He knows that the decree has been sent out that eventually the Jews will be dealt with. So he just refrains himself, and he calls his wife and friends. And let's read verses 11 and 12. "And Haman told them of the glory of his riches, and the multitude of his children, and all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. Haman said moreover, Yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself, and tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. So Haman is bragging of all the things that he has. And if we look back in Esther 3:1, it confirms the things that Esther has been talking about. It says, After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him, and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. And in Esther 9 and 12, it talks about his 10 sons, so the multitude of his children. And let's just read some scripture about boasting and bragging. So we know that Mordecai is really proud and he loves to boast and brag. He calls his friends and his wife over to, he begins by bragging about, everything that he's been given. So Proverbs 27:1 says, Boast not thyself of tomorrow, for thou knowest not what a day may bring forth. 1 Corinthians 4:7. Now this is not King James Version. But it says, Who says you are better than others? What do you have that was not given to you? And if it was given to you, why do you brag as if you did not receive it as a gift? And 2 Corinthians 11:30, If I must boast, I will boast about the things that show how weak I am. So the Bible talks about that we are not to brag and boast about things. And Haman just really likes to do that. Okay, verse 13. Yet all this availeth me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So everything Haman has been bragging about means nothing to him as long as Mordecai is still around. He has all these things that he apparently is proud of, but he cannot be content with them because one person won't bow down to him. And that made me think that maybe we're kind of like Haman too at times. We have so many blessings, but one thing can make us have a bad day, or one thing can just really make us forget about all the other blessings we have. One person hating us can make us forget of all the love we have. The Bible speaks many times on being content and to be cautious of seeking material possessions. So Philippians 4:11 says, Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am to be content. Luke 12:15. And he said unto them, Take heed and beware of covetousness, and for a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things which he possesseth. 1 Timothy 6:6-8. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. Hebrews 13:5. Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have, for he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. And Matthew 6:19-20. Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. So Haman had a God-sized hole in his heart that nothing could fill. He sought out material possessions, he sought out high positions, and he thought that he was above others. So without God, though, we will never be truly happy or content, no matter how highly we may think of ourselves. And the last verse, verse 14. Then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends unto him, Let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king, that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. So Haman's friends and wife tell him to build the gallows 75 feet high, that is 50 cubits, so 75 feet high, and to hang Mordecai on. Then he could go happily to the banquet. And he sets forth building the gallows. So that is chapter 5 of the book of Esther. And we will see next chapter what happens that very night of that first banquet. So I will see you next time.